Long before nations drew borders, and long before the sea was mapped and measured, the world moved at a slower pace. The oceans were not highways of trade or arenas of power. They were vast, uncertain spaces, shaped by wind, tide, and human patience. In that distant age, the sea did not belong to anyone. It was open, quiet, and dangerous, and along its edges, the earliest forms of piracy began to take shape. These first sea raiders were not legends. They did not sail under flags or search for treasure. They were ordinary people living near the coast, fishermen, traders, and farmers whose lives were shaped by scarcity. When harvests failed or trade routes shifted, survival became uncertain. For some, the sea offered an alternative. It was easier to take than to produce, easier to strike briefly and disappear than to endure hunger on land. Piracy was not born from ambition, but from necessity. The earliest traces of organized sea raiding appear in the eastern Mediterranean, thousands of years ago. This region, dotted with islands and narrow coastlines, became one of the first networks of maritime trade. Ships carried oil, grain, wine, and textiles between distant ports. Where goods moved, vulnerability followed. Small vessels, lightly defended, passed through predictable routes, and some learned to wait in silence for the right moment. Ancient records from Egypt speak of mysterious groups arriving from the sea. They came without warning, attacked coastal settlements, and vanished again beyond the horizon. These groups were later called the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain uncertain, but their impact was real. Cities burned, trade faltered, and fear traveled faster than any ship. To those who lived along the coast, the sea was no longer only a source of life. It had become a source of threat. In this early world, piracy had no moral weight. It was neither praised nor condemned in the way it would be later. It simply existed. In ancient Greek culture, this attitude is clearly visible. In the stories attributed to Homer, raiding coastal villages is described almost casually. Heroes ask one another whether they are traders or raiders, as if both were equally acceptable paths. Taking from others was not yet a crime. It was a way of navigating an unpredictable world. The Greek word from which piracy later emerged did not mean thief. It meant one who attempts, one who dares. There was a sense of action and risk rather than shame. The sea, filled with islands and hidden coves, was difficult to control. Small boats could strike quickly and retreat into places where larger forces could not follow. Law on land did not easily extend over water, and in that space between order and chaos, piracy found room to breathe. As maritime trade expanded, so did opportunity. More ships carried more goods across longer distances. Wealth moved steadily over water, and with it grew temptation. Some coastal communities suffered repeated attacks. Others made quiet arrangements. Pirates were offered shelter, supplies, or information in exchange for protection or shared profit. The line between raider and defender blurred. A pirate to one city could be an ally to another. Over time, piracy became more organized. Certain regions gained reputations as havens for sea raiders. Along the southern coast of what is now Turkey, rocky shores and hidden bays provided ideal conditions. From these places, pirates launched attacks, captured ships, and took people for ransom. They built temporary bases, not cities, but places of return, shaped by the rhythm of the sea. Even the great powers of the ancient world could not ignore the problem. Empires depended on steady supplies. When grain ships failed to arrive, entire cities felt the absence. Piracy was no longer a distant nuisance. It became a threat to stability itself. Yet despite military responses, the underlying causes remained. Where trade flowed without protection, piracy returned. Where people lived without security, the sea offered an escape. The birth of piracy was not a single event. It was a gradual response to movement, inequality, and opportunity. It emerged wherever the sea connected distant lives and left gaps between power and protection. In Antiquity, piracy was neither romantic nor infamous. It was quiet, practical, and persistent, shaped by wind, hunger, and the open horizon. As night settles over the ancient sea, ships drift under unfamiliar stars. Oars move softly through dark water. Somewhere between coast and sky, the first pirates move with purpose, unaware that their choices will echo through history. The sea remains wide, and for now, it belongs to no one. As maritime life became more complex, the sea slowly changed its meaning. What had once been an open space of movement and uncertainty began to carry weight. Routes formed, harbors grew. Cities depended not only on the land around them, but on distant shores connected by water. With this dependence came a new awareness. The sea could no longer remain lawless without consequence. In ancient Greece, the relationship with piracy shifted gradually. Early communities had tolerated sea raiding as a fact of life, sometimes even as a skill worthy of respect. But as city-states expanded and trade increased, the cost of instability grew clearer. Ships no longer carried only small cargoes for local exchange. They transported grain, oil, metals, and people across hundreds of miles. When these ships failed to arrive, entire regions felt the loss. Greek city-states responded in different ways. Some invested in fleets, building warships, not only to defend against foreign enemies, but to patrol nearby waters. Others formed alliances, sharing responsibility for protecting common routes. Yet the geography of the Aegean made complete control impossible. Countless islands, narrow passages, and hidden inlets offered endless places to hide. Pirates adapted quickly, learning where authority was weakest and response slowest. At the same time, the moral understanding of piracy continued to evolve. What had once been an accepted practice began to be seen as a threat to order. Philosophers and lawmakers increasingly described pirates as enemies of the community, not daring adventurers. Still, reality remained complicated. In times of war, pirates were often hired or tolerated if they weakened rivals. Peace and principle were flexible when survival or advantage was at stake. As Greek influence gave way to Roman power, the struggle against piracy entered a new phase. Rome was built on land, disciplined and structured, but its growth tied it inevitably to the sea. Grain from North Africa fed the city. Goods from across the Mediterranean supported its economy. When pirates disrupted these routes, the effects were immediate and severe. Shortages led to unrest. Hunger threatened political stability. Unlike the fragmented Greek world, Rome pursued centralized solutions. Piracy was no longer a local problem, but a matter of state security. Roman leaders recognized that scattered efforts would fail. What was needed was coordination, authority, and speed. Yet even Rome hesitated at first, distracted by wars on land and internal conflict. Pirates exploited this delay, growing bolder and more organized. In some regions, piracy became almost institutional. Along certain coasts, entire communities depended on raiding and ransom. Captured sailors and travelers were held for payment, traded, or sold. The sea became a network, not only of trade, but of fear. Roman merchants traveled armed or in convoys, but even these measures offered limited protection. Eventually, the pressure became unavoidable. Rome granted extraordinary powers to military leaders tasked with clearing the sea. Fleets were expanded. The Mediterranean was divided into zones, each assigned to a commander with clear responsibility. Bases were destroyed, ships captured, and known hideouts emptied. For the first time, piracy faced a sustained, coordinated response. Yet Rome's approach was not only violent. Recognizing that piracy thrived on desperation, Roman authorities also offered alternatives. Some pirates were granted amnesty, allowed to settle inland and begin new lives. Land replaced the sea. Stability replaced uncertainty. This strategy weakened piracy more effectively than force alone, removing not just ships, but reasons. For a time, the sea grew quieter. Trade flowed more predictably. Harbors flourished under Roman protection. But the deeper lesson remained. Piracy had not vanished because it had been defeated in spirit. It had retreated because conditions had changed. Order held, but only as long as power was present. In the ancient world, the struggle against pirates revealed something fundamental. Control of the sea was never permanent. It required constant effort, cooperation, and balance. When that balance failed, piracy returned, not as rebellion, but as response. As evening falls over the Mediterranean, Roman ships patrol familiar waters. Lanterns reflect on calm waves. For now, the routes are safe, yet beneath the surface lies a truth learned slowly and often forgotten. The sea remembers every absence of order, and it waits patiently for them to return. As the structures of the ancient world weakened, the rhythm of life across Europe began to change. Roads fell quiet, cities shrank. Trade moved more slowly and often closer to home. After the authority of Rome faded in the west, the old systems of protection dissolved with it. The sea remained wide and open, but now it bordered a world less certain than before. In this space of fragmentation and silence, a new kind of sea raider appeared. Far to the north, along the rugged coasts of Scandinavia, communities lived in close contact with the sea. The land was harsh and the growing season short. Survival depended on skill, cooperation, and movement. Boats were not luxuries, but necessities. From an early age, people learned to read wind and water, to trust wood and rope, and to accept risk as part of life. Over time, these skills shaped a culture that was both practical and mobile. The people later known as Vikings did not initially set out to conquer. Their early journeys were small and seasonal. They fished, traded, explored nearby shores. But as populations grew and resources became strained, the horizon offered opportunity. Beyond familiar waters lay monasteries, towns, and trading posts, often wealthy and lightly defended. The sea provided a path that bypassed walls and armies alike. The first recorded raids shocked those who witnessed them. Quiet coastal communities were suddenly exposed to swift attacks. Long, narrow ships appeared without warning, carried by oars and sail. Raiders struck quickly, took what they could, and vanished before resistance could form. These attacks were not random. They were calculated responses to vulnerability, shaped by observation and timing. Monasteries became frequent targets, not because of religion, but because of circumstance. They were often isolated, rich in portable valuables, and poorly protected. Gold, silver, manuscripts, and food stores were taken. People were captured and carried away. News of these raids spread rapidly, carried by rumor and fear. To those on land, the sea once again became a source of uncertainty. Viking ships were central to this success. Designed to travel both open seas and shallow rivers, they extended the reach of raiders far inland. Rivers became corridors rather than barriers. Settlements that believed themselves safe discovered that water connected more than it separated. The ability to move between sea and river blurred the line between coast and interior. Yet the Viking world was not defined solely by violence. Raiding existed alongside trade, settlement, and diplomacy. The same ships that carried warriors also carried goods and stories. Vikings traded furs, amber, and metalwork. They formed temporary alliances and long-term communities. In many places, raiders became settlers, integrating into local populations and reshaping them quietly over generations. As the centuries passed, responses evolved. Kings and local leaders attempted to defend their territories. Fortifications were built. Watch systems developed. Fleets were organized where resources allowed. Yet protection was uneven. The political landscape of early medieval Europe was fractured, and coordination was difficult. Where defenses strengthened, raids shifted elsewhere. Over time, the Viking presence transformed from sudden disruption into lasting influence. In some regions, new political structures emerged from this interaction. Laws changed, languages absorbed new words, trade routes adapted. What began as fear slowly became familiarity, and eventually, memory. The Viking raids were not an interruption of history, but a continuation under new conditions. They reflected a world in transition, where authority was local, borders were fluid, and the sea remained a powerful connector. Piracy during this period was not a single identity, but a phase, one expression of movement in an unsettled age. As night falls over northern waters, long ships rest against quiet shores. The wind carries no banners, only the sound of waves against wood. In the shadow of the Middle Ages, the sea remains open, and those who understand it best continue to move, guided by stars, instinct, and the promise of distant land. As Europe moved through centuries of fragmentation and local power, a different rhythm emerged farther south and east. Across North Africa, the Middle East, and the shores of the Indian Ocean, new cities grew, and old ones revived. Knowledge traveled alongside goods. Astronomy, mathematics, navigation, and law flourished. In this interconnected world, the sea once again became a central pathway, carrying trade, ideas, and people across great distances, and where movement increased, piracy quietly followed. From the 7th century onward, maritime routes linking the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean expanded steadily. Ships sailed between ports in Egypt, the Levant, Arabia, East Africa, and South Asia. Spices, silk, gold, ivory, and grain passed through these waters, often changing hands many times before reaching their destinations. These routes were vital, but they were also long and difficult to protect. Authority weakened as distance grew, and in those gaps, piracy found space. Piracy in the Islamic world did not take a single form. It varied by region, period, and circumstance. In some cases, it appeared as independent raiding, carried out by small groups seeking profit or survival. In others, it merged with warfare, politics, or religious conflict. The boundary between pirate, sailor, and soldier was often unclear, shaped less by identity than by moment and opportunity. Muslim sailors were skilled navigators. They understood seasonal winds, especially the monsoon system of the Indian Ocean, which allowed predictable long-distance travel. Their ships, including various forms of lateen-rigged vessels, were fast and flexible. These same qualities that supported trade could also support raiding. Small fleets could strike quickly, relying on speed and familiarity with the sea rather than overwhelming force. Along the Mediterranean coast, especially in regions of North Africa, piracy became closely tied to shifting political power. As central control weakened or changed hands, coastal towns sometimes turned to raiding as an economic strategy. Ships were taken, cargo seized, and captives held for ransom or sold. These actions were not always condemned locally. In times of instability, they were often seen as practical responses to uncertainty. Religion played a complex role. In periods of conflict between Islamic and Christian powers, attacks on enemy shipping were sometimes framed as legitimate acts of war. The language of faith provided justification, but the underlying motives were frequently economic. Wealth moved by sea, and capturing it weakened rivals while strengthening local communities. Yet piracy also existed within the Islamic world itself. Ships belonging to fellow Muslims were not immune when political divisions or personal gain outweighed solidarity. The Indian Ocean presented a different environment. Its vast scale made control difficult, and its trade networks extended across cultures and continents. From the coasts of East Africa to the ports of India and Southeast Asia, merchants relied on predictable winds and shared customs. Piracy here often took the form of ambush rather than domination. Narrow straits, islands, and shallow waters offered opportunities to strike and disappear. As in the Mediterranean, local conditions shaped behavior more than ideology. Despite its presence, piracy rarely disrupted the overall flow of trade for long. Merchants adapted, convoys formed, agreements were made with local leaders. Sometimes pirates themselves became intermediaries, offering protection in exchange for payment. The sea economy absorbed piracy as one of its many risks, much like storms or shifting currents. In major centers of power, efforts were made to limit these threats. Fleets were organized, harbors fortified, laws developed to regulate maritime behavior. Yet enforcement was uneven, and complete control remained elusive. The sea resisted boundaries, and authority weakened the farther ships traveled from their home ports. Over time, patterns repeated. Periods of strong governance reduced piracy temporarily. Periods of transition saw its return. This cycle was not unique to the Islamic world, but here it unfolded across a particularly wide and diverse maritime landscape. The result was not chaos, but adaptation, a balance between order and freedom that shifted with circumstance. As night settles over the warm waters of the southern seas, sails move quietly beneath familiar stars. The routes are known, the winds expected. Somewhere between departure and arrival, watchful eyes remain alert. In the Islamic world, piracy was neither an exception nor a constant, but a reflection of movement itself, shaped by trade, power, and the endless openness of the sea. When the Crusades began, the Mediterranean entered a period of lasting tension. Armies moved across land, but their lifeline lay on water. Ships carried soldiers, pilgrims, supplies, weapons, and promises across long distances. Ports became gateways to distant wars, and the sea itself turned into a corridor of belief, ambition, and uncertainty. In this environment, piracy did not simply continue. It changed shape and quietly expanded. The first crusading expeditions revealed a simple truth. Control of land meant little without access to the sea. The eastern Mediterranean connected Europe to the Levant, and every journey depended on ships. This reliance created vulnerability. Fleets were often improvised, protection uneven, coordination limited. Many ships sailed alone or in small groups, moving slowly under the weight of cargo and expectation. For those watching from hidden shores, opportunity became visible. Piracy during the Crusades rarely followed a single identity. Some raiders were independent sailors responding to the disorder of war. Others were former soldiers, mercenaries, or displaced men who found no place when campaigns ended. War created movement, and movement left gaps. In these gaps, piracy grew, not as rebellion, but as adaptation. The religious divide between Christian and Muslim powers added another layer. Attacking enemy ships could be framed as legitimate warfare rather than crime. This framing allowed piracy to blend into sanctioned violence. A raid against an opposing fleet might be praised by one side and condemned by the other. The same act could be seen as defense, devotion, or theft, depending on perspective. Moral boundaries shifted with allegiance. Italian maritime cities played a complex role. Ports such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa provided ships and expertise to crusading forces. In return, they gained trade privileges, influence, and wealth. Their fleets were powerful, organized, and often armed. Yet, alongside official missions, unofficial actions occurred. Competition between these cities was fierce, and attacks on rival shipping were not uncommon. Commerce and conflict moved together, quietly supported by the sea. As crusader states formed along the eastern Mediterranean coast, new ports emerged. These cities required constant supply. Grain, timber, weapons, and people arrived by ship. Protecting these routes proved difficult. Fleets were stretched thin, and attention focused on land battles. Pirates understood this imbalance. They targeted supply lines rather than armies, knowing disruption could be as effective as conquest. Islands became central to this maritime struggle. Places like Cyprus, Crete, and Rhodes offered shelter, fresh water, and strategic position. They were natural resting points and ideal bases. Some were controlled by military orders or kingdoms. Others existed in a gray zone, loosely governed and easily influenced. From these islands, ships could reach multiple routes, strike briefly, and withdraw before pursuit arrived. Over time, piracy became more organized. Raiding groups learned to cooperate, sharing information and resources. They understood seasonal patterns, convoy schedules, and political shifts. Violence was calculated, not chaotic. Ships were boarded efficiently, cargo selected carefully. Captives were valuable, not only for ransom, but for information. Knowledge traveled as quickly as goods. Yet piracy during the Crusades was not constant disruption. Trade continued, adapted, and even flourished in some regions. Merchants negotiated protection, paid fees, or traveled under escort. Some pirates transitioned into privateers, operating with implicit approval from rulers who benefited from weakened enemies. The line between piracy and policy blurred further. As the Crusades progressed and eventually declined, their maritime consequences remained. The sea had become accustomed to conflict. Raiding was no longer exceptional. It was expected. Generations grew up knowing that ships might not return, that the horizon carried both arrival and loss. Piracy settled into the rhythm of movement, shaped by belief, power, and necessity. When the last crusading banners faded from the coastline, the conditions that supported piracy did not disappear. Ports remained busy. Rivalries persisted. The sea, once again, absorbed the aftermath of human ambition. As night falls over the eastern Mediterranean, anchored ships creak softly in sheltered harbors. Lanterns reflect on still water. The wars of faith feel distant, but their echoes remain, carried by waves that remember every passage. In the age of the Crusades, piracy rose not as an interruption of history, but as its quiet companion, moving wherever the sea allowed space. By the early 16th century, the Mediterranean had entered a new balance of power. Empires rose with clear ambitions, borders hardened on land, and fleets grew larger and more disciplined. Yet the sea itself remained open, shaped by islands, narrow passages, and hidden shores. In this environment, a different kind of maritime force emerged, neither fully pirate nor fully navy, but something in between. These were the Ottoman sea warriors and the corsairs of North Africa, men whose lives were bound to the rhythm of the Mediterranean and whose influence would reshape it. Along the southern shores, particularly in what is now Algeria, coastal cities lived under constant pressure. European powers extended their reach across the sea, occupying ports and building fortresses. Local communities faced uncertainty, caught between distant empires and immediate threats. In this tension, seafaring offered protection, income, and power. Raiding became not only a means of survival, but a political tool. From this world rose a family of brothers whose names would echo across the sea. Born on the island of Lesbos, they grew up surrounded by water, trade, and movement. Their early lives were unremarkable. They sailed as merchants, fishermen, and sailors, learning routes and winds rather than strategy or ideology. Yet circumstances pushed them toward a different path. Encounters with hostile fleets and coastal conflicts turned defense into retaliation, and retaliation into mastery. The eldest brother gained early fame as a capable and fearless leader. Operating along the North African coast, he challenged European forces that threatened local ports. His actions were welcomed by coastal communities seeking protection, and his reputation grew. Ships gathered under his command, not bound by nationality, but by loyalty and shared purpose. These men came from many places: Anatolia, the Balkans, the Arab world, drawn by opportunity and the promise of the sea. After his death, leadership passed to his younger brother, known to history as Hayreddin Barbarossa. Unlike his predecessor, he combined maritime skill with political insight. He understood that lasting power required legitimacy as well as force. Aligning himself with the Ottoman Empire, he transformed his fleet from an independent corsair force into an extension of imperial strength. This alliance changed the nature of Mediterranean warfare. Under Ottoman protection, North African ports became centers of organized seafaring power. Shipyards expanded, crews trained systematically. Raiding was no longer random. It followed patterns, seasons, and strategic goals. European shipping faced coordinated pressure, while Ottoman interests gained reach far beyond the coast. The Mediterranean became a contested space where influence moved as fluidly as water. Barbarossa's fleets did not rely solely on size or firepower. They depended on knowledge. Familiarity with currents, winds, and coastal geography allowed them to strike efficiently and withdraw quickly. Islands and coves served as natural extensions of their strategy. The sea itself became an ally, offering concealment and escape where rigid formations could not follow. These corsairs were often labeled pirates by their enemies, yet they operated within a broader system. They collected tribute, negotiated ransoms, and enforced regional authority. Captives were taken, not only for profit, but as part of an economy shaped by conflict. To those living along the Mediterranean, this was neither chaos nor romance. It was the reality of power at sea. The balance shifted decisively after major naval confrontations demonstrated Ottoman strength. Victories secured dominance in key regions and confirmed Barbarossa's role as both admiral and legend. He moved between sea and court, between battle and governance, embodying the fusion of corsair tradition and imperial structure. His death marked the end of a life spent almost entirely on water, guided by wind and opportunity. After him, others continued the practice. Corsair cities remained active. Raiding persisted, now embedded in a wider system of rivalry between empires. Yet the foundation had been laid. The Mediterranean had become a space where piracy and state power overlapped, where loyalty was flexible, and where the sea rewarded those who understood it deeply. As evening settles over the central Mediterranean, harbors grow quiet. Ships rest beneath fading light. The era of the great corsairs does not announce itself with sudden endings. It drifts, like the sea itself, carrying stories of men who ruled not from thrones, but from decks shaped by salt, wind, and endless movement. As the great empires of Europe strengthened their hold on land, their attention turned increasingly toward the sea. Oceans and narrow straits became extensions of political ambition. Control of maritime routes meant access to wealth, influence, and survival itself. Yet maintaining large permanent navies was costly, and the demands of war were constant. In this environment, European powers developed a solution that blurred the line between state authority and individual action. Private warships entered the stage. These vessels were not owned directly by kings or empires. Instead, they belonged to merchants, nobles, or experienced sailors who received official permission to wage war at sea. This permission came in the form of legal documents that authorized them to attack enemy shipping. With these papers, private captains operated in the gray space between piracy and naval service. To their sponsors, they were defenders and tools of strategy. To their victims, they were little different from pirates. The system emerged gradually. As conflicts between European states became more frequent, naval warfare extended far beyond traditional battlefields. Ships carrying goods were as valuable as armies, sometimes more so. Disrupting trade weakened economies and strained governments. Private warships offered a way to apply pressure without the expense of full naval deployment. Risk shifted from the state to the individual, while reward flowed in both directions. These private crews were often highly skilled. Many had sailed as merchants or fishermen before turning to war. They understood navigation, weather, and the behavior of ships under stress. Their vessels were chosen for speed and maneuverability rather than size. Armed sufficiently to overpower merchant ships, they avoided direct confrontation with war fleets. Their strength lay in timing, intelligence, and restraint. Ports along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts became centers of this activity. Harbors filled with ships awaiting authorization, repair, or sale of captured goods. Taverns and counting houses replaced royal courts as places where plans were made. Information became currency. Knowing when a convoy would sail or which route it would take was often more valuable than weapons. The legal nature of private warships gave them protection, but only temporarily. When wars ended or alliances shifted, these permissions expired. A captain who was celebrated one season could be declared a criminal the next. Some adapted, returning to trade or accepting new commissions. Others continued their practices without approval, sliding quietly into piracy. The transition required no change of ship, only of paper. For governments, the arrangement was effective, but unstable. Private warships could weaken enemies, but they were difficult to control. Some exceeded their orders, attacking neutral vessels or pursuing profit over policy. Diplomatic tensions followed, and accusations of tolerated piracy became common. The sea once again resisted clear boundaries. Over time, maritime law attempted to impose structure. Courts debated what constituted lawful capture. Insurance systems developed to manage loss. Naval patrols increased, yet enforcement lagged behind practice. The sea was vast, and authority weakened with distance. Private warships continued to operate wherever opportunity appeared greater than risk. This system shaped European expansion. As overseas colonies grew, private vessels supported exploration, settlement, and conflict. They escorted convoys, attacked rivals, and mapped unfamiliar waters. Their actions influenced the balance of power far beyond Europe's shores. In many cases, the first European presence in distant regions arrived not under a national flag, but through privately armed ships. Despite their importance, life aboard these vessels was uncertain. Crews faced storms, disease, and combat, with little guarantee of reward. Payment depended on success, and failure often meant debt or abandonment. Discipline varied, shaped by the captain's authority rather than state regulation. Loyalty was practical, built on shared risk rather than ideology. As European navies grew stronger and more centralized, reliance on private warships gradually declined. States sought greater control over violence at sea. Permanent fleets replaced temporary solutions, yet the legacy remained. The habits, skills, and expectations forged in this era carried forward into later forms of maritime conflict. As dusk settles over European harbors, silhouettes of ships rest against the fading light. Some are owned by kings, others by individuals whose names may never be remembered. Together, they reflect a moment in history when power at sea was shared, negotiated, and often contested. moving quietly between law and opportunity with the tide. As European ships began to cross oceans rather than coastlines, the world expanded in quiet but irreversible ways. Horizons grew wider, routes longer, and the sea itself became a bridge between continents that had never known one another. This period, later called the Age of Exploration, reshaped trade, power, and perception. It also reshaped piracy, carrying it into unfamiliar waters and giving it new purpose. The discovery of new lands across the Atlantic altered the balance of wealth almost immediately. Precious metals, agricultural products, and exotic goods flowed from the Americas toward Europe. These voyages were long, dangerous, and slow. Ships traveled heavily loaded, dependent on wind and season, often isolated for weeks at a time. Protection was limited, especially in the early years, when empires were still learning how to manage distances they barely understood. For those who watched these routes, opportunity appeared on the horizon. The Atlantic and the Caribbean were vast, filled with islands, shallow passages, and hidden anchorages. Unlike the Mediterranean, where centuries of conflict had shaped expectations, these waters were new and loosely controlled. Authority existed in name more than in practice. Where control weakened, piracy adapted quickly. Many of the early pirates of the New World were not strangers to the sea. They were former sailors, soldiers, or private warship crews whose commissions had ended. Others were settlers who found life in the colonies harsher than promised. The sea offered an alternative, uncertain but immediate. A single successful raid could yield more than years of labor on land. Piracy in the New World developed alongside imperial rivalry. Spain held vast territories and controlled the richest routes. Other European powers, excluded from these claims, looked for indirect ways to benefit. Attacking Spanish shipping weakened a rival while enriching the attacker. In this context, piracy and private warfare overlapped again. Legal permissions were granted and withdrawn, sometimes deliberately vague, allowing states to benefit without full responsibility. The geography of the Caribbean shaped behavior. Islands provided shelter and fresh water. Narrow channels forced ships into predictable paths. Storms and reefs added risk, slowing heavily laden vessels. Pirates learned these patterns carefully. They waited rather than chased, relying on patience more than force. Their success depended on timing, not spectacle. Ports began to appear that existed primarily to serve this maritime world. They were places of repair, exchange, and rest, often distant from strong governance. Here, crews gathered, shared information, and planned voyages. These communities were fluid, shaped by movement rather than permanence. Law was negotiated rather than enforced, and loyalty followed opportunity. The psychological impact of piracy in the New World was significant. Merchants sailed with constant awareness of vulnerability. Convoys formed, escorts increased, and insurance systems emerged to manage loss. Yet these measures lagged behind reality. The sea remained unpredictable, and pirates adjusted as defenses changed. Each improvement in protection led to new strategies of evasion. Despite its violence, piracy did not halt exploration or trade. Instead, it became part of the environment. Ships sailed knowing the risk, calculating it alongside storms and disease. The ocean absorbed conflict quietly, its surface unchanged by human intention. What mattered was not the absence of danger, but familiarity with it. Over time, empires responded with greater organization. Naval patrols expanded. Fortifications rose along key harbors. Laws tightened, attempting to draw clear distinctions between lawful war and crime. Yet enforcement remained uneven. Distance weakened authority, and communication moved slowly. By the time orders arrived, circumstances had often shifted. The New World did not create piracy, but it transformed it. Scale increased. Routes lengthened. Stakes grew higher. Piracy became less local and more global, moving across oceans rather than seas. It followed wealth wherever it traveled, adapting quietly to new environments. As night settles over the open Atlantic, ships move under unfamiliar stars. The land behind them fades, and the destination ahead remains uncertain. Between departure and arrival, the sea holds all possibilities. In the age of exploration, piracy did not stand apart from history. It moved within it, carried forward by wind, ambition, and the endless space between shores. As the routes between Europe and the New World became firmly established, the Caribbean emerged as their central crossroads. Ships arriving from distant continents slowed as they passed through narrow channels and island passages. Harbors multiplied. Trade intensified. What had once been open sea transformed into a dense network of movement, carrying goods, people, and expectation. In this environment, piracy did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, shaped by geography and circumstance. The Caribbean was unlike any maritime region Europe had known before. Its waters were warm and shallow in places, filled with reefs, sandbanks, and hidden coves. Islands lay close enough to offer shelter, but far enough apart to create isolation. For large, heavily loaded ships, navigation required caution. For smaller, faster vessels, the same conditions offered advantage. Knowledge of local waters became more valuable than strength. Spanish control dominated the region in the early years. Vast amounts of wealth passed through Caribbean ports, carried from the mainland toward Europe. Gold and silver moved in steady streams, along routes that soon became known to those who watched carefully. Protection was uneven, and distances were long. A ship delayed by weather or damage could find itself alone, far from help. Piracy in the Caribbean grew from this imbalance. Early raiders were often hunters, fishermen, or settlers familiar with the coastline. They began by targeting small vessels or isolated communities. Over time, their ambitions expanded. Experience replaced improvisation. Groups formed, sharing resources and information. The sea became their domain not through conquest, but through familiarity. Ports developed that served this new maritime culture. Some were officially recognized, others barely acknowledged. They offered repair, supplies, and markets for captured goods. These places were temporary in spirit, shaped by arrival and departure. Rather than permanence, authority shifted with the tides, and rules were flexible, adapted to circumstance. European rivalries intensified the process. France, England, and the Netherlands sought to challenge Spanish dominance without open war. Raiding Spanish shipping served this purpose effectively. Permissions were granted quietly, encouraging attacks while maintaining plausible distance. In this environment, piracy and policy intertwined. The distinction between state service and private gain blurred further. The Caribbean also shaped the social structure of piracy. Crews formed from many backgrounds: former sailors, escaped servants, displaced soldiers. Life at sea offered an alternative to rigid colonial hierarchies. Decisions were often shared, leadership negotiated, risk was distributed, and reward divided. These arrangements were practical responses to constant uncertainty rather than ideological choices. Violence existed, but it was measured. Pirates preferred surrender to resistance, capture to destruction. Ships were valuable intact, and lives carried economic weight. Reputation mattered. A known presence could achieve compliance without battle. Fear traveled faster than ships, reducing the need for confrontation. As piracy became more established, so did resistance. Colonial authorities attempted to strengthen defenses. Forts were built, convoys organized, and patrols expanded. Yet coordination remained difficult. The Caribbean's size and complexity resisted control. Every measure produced adaptation. Pirates shifted routes, changed bases, or aligned temporarily with local interests. Trade continued despite these tensions. Merchants adjusted expectations. Insurance developed. Loss became part of calculation. The sea remained active, its surface unchanged by human conflict. Piracy did not replace commerce. It moved alongside it, a shadow shaped by the same forces. The birth of piracy in the Caribbean was not a single moment, but a process. It emerged from wealth in motion, uneven authority, and a landscape that favored speed and knowledge. Over time, this combination created a distinct maritime culture, neither fully outlaw nor fully sanctioned, but deeply rooted in the rhythms of the region. As dusk settles over Caribbean waters, anchored ships sway gently in protected bays. Palm-lined shores fall silent. The routes remain busy, the risks familiar. In these waters, piracy did not announce itself with banners or declarations. It arrived quietly, carried by wind, shaped by geography, and sustained by the endless movement of the sea. By the late 17th century, the conditions that had quietly shaped piracy began to align. Trade routes were established and predictable. Empires were stretched across oceans, managing distant colonies with limited reach. Wars between European powers ended and resumed in cycles, leaving behind thousands of sailors without purpose or pay. In this moment of transition, piracy entered a phase that later generations would remember as its golden age. This period did not begin with a declaration or a single event. It unfolded gradually, as experienced seamen found themselves adrift between peace and war. Private warships were dismissed when treaties were signed. Crews accustomed to risk and reward were suddenly released into ports with few opportunities. The sea, familiar and indifferent, remained their most reliable option. The Caribbean became the heart of this transformation. Its geography favored movement over control. Islands offered shelter. Trade routes converged. Wealth passed through narrow waters in steady flow. Pirates no longer operated only as scattered raiders. They formed networks, sharing intelligence and resources. Success depended less on chance and more on coordination. Ships during this era reflected the shift. They were chosen for speed and maneuverability, not size. Crews learned to approach quietly, relying on surprise rather than force. Flags were raised only at the final moment, when recognition mattered more than concealment. Reputation became a tool. A known name or symbol could end resistance before it began. The social structure aboard pirate ships also evolved. Leadership was often elected, authority conditional. Decisions affecting the crew were discussed openly, not imposed from above. This was not ideology, but practicality. Mutual dependence encouraged cooperation. Fair distribution reduced conflict. In a world where life was uncertain, shared risk demanded shared voice. Pirate communities began to form ashore as well. Certain ports became gathering points where crews rested, repaired ships, and exchanged information. These places were neither fully lawful nor entirely chaotic. Rules existed, shaped by necessity rather than decree. Markets operated openly. Disputes were settled quickly. The rhythm of arrival and departure defined daily life. Violence remained present, but it was controlled. The goal was capture, not destruction. Ships intact were more valuable than wreckage. Crews surrendered more often than they fought, knowing resistance brought greater loss. Pirates understood this dynamic and relied on it. Fear, once established, reduced the need for bloodshed. Colonial authorities observed these developments with growing concern. Piracy disrupted trade, challenged authority, and embarrassed distant governments. Yet responses were inconsistent. Some officials benefited quietly from pirate activity. Others lacked resources to intervene. Distance delayed orders. The sea remained faster than bureaucracy. The Golden Age was shaped as much by perception as by reality. Stories traveled quickly between ports. Success was exaggerated, failures forgotten. Names spread across the sea, carried by rumor and repetition. These stories created identity, reinforcing behavior and expectation. Piracy became not just an act, but a role, understood and imitated. Despite its later reputation, this era was brief. It depended on specific conditions, loose control, abundant targets, and experienced crews without alternatives. As states adjusted, strengthened navies, and reasserted authority, the balance would shift again. But for a time, the sea belonged to those who knew it best. As night falls over the Caribbean, ships drift quietly beyond the reach of shore. Lanterns dim, voices lower. In this moment, the Golden Age does not feel legendary. It feels practical, temporary, shaped by circumstance rather than destiny. The sea continues its steady movement, indifferent to names, carrying this chapter of piracy forward without pause. As piracy reached its most organized phase, life at sea began to reflect patterns rarely found on land. Crews drawn from different nations, languages, and pasts needed order to survive. Authority based solely on force proved unstable. In response, pirates developed systems of governance shaped by necessity, equality of risk, and constant uncertainty. From these conditions emerged what later observers would describe as pirate republics and pirate democracy. These communities were not formal states. They had no borders recognized by empires and no laws written for permanence. Instead, they existed wherever pirates gathered long enough to require structure. Ships became moving societies. Harbors became temporary capitals. What mattered was not territory, but agreement. On board a pirate ship, power rarely rested in a single hand. Captains were chosen, not appointed by birth or crown. Their authority depended on competence rather than title. In battle, they commanded absolutely. Outside of combat, their power was limited. Major decisions were discussed openly. Routes, targets, and discipline were matters of collective concern. This balance reduced internal conflict and ensured cooperation in moments of danger. Written agreements often governed these arrangements. Sometimes called articles or codes, they outlined rules for behavior, shares of loot, and consequences for violation. These documents were practical, not idealistic. They addressed theft within the crew, desertion, violence among members, and distribution of resources. Injury compensation was specified. A lost limb carried a defined value. Risk was acknowledged openly and accounted for in advance. Equality aboard pirate ships was relative but significant. Rank differences existed, yet wealth distribution was flatter than in merchant or naval vessels. A captain might receive a double share, not absolute control. This system encouraged loyalty. When success benefited all, discipline followed naturally. When failure came, it was shared. On land, similar principles appeared in pirate havens. Places like Nassau became gathering points where crews arrived between voyages. These settlements lacked formal governments, yet order emerged through custom and mutual interest. Taverns, markets, and shipyards operated under informal rules. Disputes were resolved quickly, often through mediation rather than force. Stability depended on continued cooperation. These pirate republics attracted those who found little opportunity elsewhere. Sailors escaping harsh discipline, laborers fleeing debt, and men without patronage found space here. The absence of rigid hierarchy offered temporary freedom. Identity mattered less than ability. Reputation replaced lineage. Pirate democracy was not philosophical. It was situational. The sea demanded trust, and trust required fairness. A divided crew risked failure. These systems emerged not from abstract ideals, but from survival. They functioned as long as circumstances allowed. When pressure increased, they adapted or dissolved. External powers viewed these arrangements with suspicion. Pirate havens challenged authority and disrupted trade. Efforts to suppress them grew more determined. Amnesty offers, military intervention, and legal reforms targeted both ships and settlements. Some pirates accepted pardons and reintegrated into colonial life. Others resisted, choosing risk over submission. Despite their temporary nature, pirate republics left a lasting impression. They demonstrated that alternative forms of organization could arise spontaneously under pressure. They revealed how shared danger reshaped social expectations. Though brief, these communities influenced how piracy was remembered, emphasizing freedom and equality over violence. As night settles over quiet harbors, abandoned docks reflect faint starlight. Ships that once carried shared hopes now rest elsewhere, or not at all. The republics fade without ceremony. What remains is the memory of a moment when order emerged without crowns or commands, guided instead by agreement, necessity, and the steady movement of the sea. In the world of piracy, the sea was often described as open to all who dared to enter it. Yet in practice, life aboard ships remained overwhelmingly male. Tradition, fear, and rigid expectations kept women at the edges of maritime life, usually confined to ports and shorebound roles. Still, the sea did not fully obey social rules. In rare moments, shaped by chance and necessity, women crossed these boundaries and became part of the floating world of pirates. Among them, two names endured longer than most: Bonny and Mary Red. Their stories unfolded during the height of the Golden Age, in a Caribbean shaped by movement and instability. Neither woman set out to become a symbol. Their paths were not guided by ideology or rebellion, but by circumstance, adaptation, and survival. Like many who turned to piracy, they moved toward the sea because other paths closed quietly behind them. Anne Bonny was born into a world that offered her little freedom. Raised in the shadow of social expectation, she resisted confinement early. Her life carried her across the Atlantic to the colonies, where rigid structures followed her. Marriage offered no refuge. Discontent grew, and with it, distance from land-based order. When she encountered a pirate crew, the decision to join them was not dramatic. It was practical. The sea offered motion where land imposed stillness. Mary Red's path was different, yet shaped by similar pressures. From childhood, she learned to disguise herself as a boy in order to survive. This disguise became habit, then identity. She served as a soldier, worked as a sailor, and moved between roles with quiet efficiency. When circumstances carried her toward piracy, the transition required little change. The sea did not question her past. It accepted skill, endurance, and silence. When Anne Bonny and Mary Red crossed paths aboard a pirate ship, recognition came not through revelation, but through shared understanding. Each recognized in the other the careful balance of concealment and resolve. Their presence aboard ship did not alter daily routine. They worked, fought, and endured alongside the rest of the crew. Identity mattered less than reliability. Accounts of their behavior emphasize participation rather than exception. They stood watch. They joined engagements. They shared risk. In moments of conflict, they were described as active rather than symbolic. This was not because piracy encouraged equality in principle, but because the sea demanded contribution. Those who could not perform did not remain long. Disguise played a quiet role in their survival. Clothing blurred identity. Routine erased distinction. On ships where hierarchy depended on trust, consistency mattered more than appearance. For Anne and Mary, concealment was not deception for advantage, but protection from limitation. The sea offered space where names and origins dissolved into function. Their story did not end in triumph. Like many pirates, they were eventually captured when fortune shifted. The same networks that carried them freely across the Caribbean tightened without warning. In captivity, their identities became visible once more. Social boundaries reasserted themselves. The sea's indifference gave way to land's judgment. In court, their cases disrupted expectation. Their presence unsettled observers more than their actions. Piracy itself was familiar by then, but women who had lived fully within it challenged assumptions. Their sentences were delayed through circumstance, but resolution came quietly. Their lives did not conclude in legend, but in uncertainty, illness, and disappearance from record. Yet memory preserved them. In a world where most pirates vanished without trace, Anne Bonny and Mary Red remained, not because they were more violent or more successful, but because they revealed something rarely seen. They showed that the boundaries of piracy were shaped less by gender than by necessity. When survival demanded it, the sea allowed exceptions. Their stories were retold, reshaped, and simplified over time. Later generations emphasized defiance and drama, smoothing over ambiguity, but beneath these layers remained quieter truths. They were not rebels against society in a modern sense. They were individuals navigating limited options, choosing movement over confinement. As night settles over calm Caribbean waters, the memory of these women drifts between history and silence. Their ships no longer sail. Their names remain, carried forward not by conquest, but by the rare alignment of circumstance and choice. In the world of piracy, where most lives dissolved into the sea, Anne Bonny and Mary Red endured as reminders that even rigid worlds sometimes bend, briefly, under the pressure of human will and the endless openness of the water. As piracy reached its height, it also revealed its limits. The same visibility that brought reputation and fear now drew attention from powers that could no longer ignore the disruption. Trade networks strained under repeated losses. Colonial governors faced pressure from merchants and insurers. Empires, once willing to tolerate piracy when it served their interests, began to see it as a threat to stability itself. Quietly and methodically, the hunt began. This shift did not happen overnight. For years, imperial authorities had relied on compromise. Pardons were offered. Boundaries were negotiated. Pirates were used when convenient and condemned when troublesome. But as global trade expanded, tolerance narrowed. Predictability became more valuable than flexibility. The sea, once allowed to remain uncertain, was slowly claimed as a space to be controlled. Governments responded first through law. New regulations redefined piracy in clearer terms. Acts, once excused as wartime service, were now criminalized. Legal distinctions between private warships and pirates were tightened. Permissions expired without renewal. Those who continued their activities found themselves without protection. A name that once granted status now invited pursuit. Alongside legal changes came visible force. Naval fleets expanded in size and coordination. Ships designed for patrol rather than battle moved steadily across known routes. Permanent squadrons replaced temporary expeditions. Ports once ignored became centers of authority. Communication improved, reducing the delays that pirates had relied upon. The sea grew smaller under watchful eyes. Colonial administrations played a central role in this transformation. Governors received direct instructions to suppress piracy decisively. Incentives were offered for capture. Informants were rewarded. Former allies became liabilities. Some pirates accepted pardons, exchanging uncertainty for survival. Others resisted, choosing familiar danger over imposed order. Public punishment became a deliberate strategy. Trials were conducted in prominent ports. Sentences were severe and visible. Executions served as warnings, designed to reach beyond those present. Bodies displayed along harbors transformed fear into policy. The message was clear and repeated. The era of tolerance had ended. Pirate communities felt the pressure immediately. Havens that had once offered shelter became traps. Information networks collapsed as trust eroded. Ships sailed less frequently. Routes changed constantly. The freedom that defined pirate life narrowed into flight. Movement replaced planning. Survival replaced profit. Some pirates adapted by withdrawing from the sea. They settled quietly, blending into colonial societies or disappearing inland. Others attempted to relocate to less controlled waters, where authority remained distant. A few continued openly, relying on speed and reputation, but numbers dwindled. The balance had shifted. Naval engagement with pirates changed as well. Rather than reacting to attacks, fleets pursued preemptively. Known routes were monitored, suspected vessels intercepted. The sea, once reactive, became proactive. Piracy no longer disrupted trade unpredictably. It was anticipated and addressed. This campaign was not without cost. Empires invested heavily in enforcement. Resources were diverted. Local economies shifted. Yet the benefits were immediate. Trade stabilized. Insurance rates fell. Confidence returned. For those dependent on maritime commerce, the hunt justified its expense. By the early 18th century, the transformation was clear. Piracy no longer shaped the rhythm of the sea. It survived only in fragments, isolated and weakened. The Golden Age faded not through a single decisive battle, but through sustained pressure and adaptation. Authority replaced ambiguity. As night falls over fortified harbors, warships rest at anchor beneath steady lantern light. Patrol routes are planned. Orders are recorded. The sea remains vast, but it no longer feels unclaimed. The pirate hunt, driven by Imperial Retribution, reshaped maritime life. It closed a chapter defined by flexibility and opened one marked by control, leaving behind echoes of a freedom that once moved easily with the tide. Far from the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, another maritime world followed its own rhythms. The seas of East Asia were older highways than many realized, carrying goods, people, and ideas long before European ships appeared on the horizon. Along the coasts of China and Japan, piracy developed not as an imitation of distant practices, but as a response to local conditions shaped by geography, trade, and authority. Here, too, the sea offered opportunity, and where opportunity met uncertainty, piracy took form. The coastline of China stretches for thousands of miles, broken by rivers, islands, and shallow bays. These waters supported dense networks of trade, linking inland markets to the wider world. Rice, silk, porcelain, and metal goods moved steadily by ship. Yet control over this vast space was difficult. Central authority weakened with distance, and enforcement varied by region. In such an environment, maritime raiding appeared not as an anomaly, but as a recurring feature. Chinese piracy often emerged during periods of restriction rather than openness. When official trade was limited or forbidden, unofficial routes flourished. Smuggling blended easily into raiding. Fishermen, merchants, and sailors moved between roles without clear separation. A ship that carried goods one season might seize them the next. Identity shifted with circumstance, shaped less by ideology than by survival. These groups were not always isolated bands. At times, piracy reached levels of organization comparable to small states. Fleets formed with internal hierarchy, codes of conduct, and systems of supply. Coastal villages participated indirectly, providing shelter, food, and information. Piracy became embedded within local economies, tolerated or ignored when it served communal needs. Japanese waters followed a different but related pattern. The islands of Japan, surrounded by narrow seas and strong currents, relied heavily on maritime movement. During periods of weak central rule, especially in times of internal conflict, coastal defense fractured. Local lords focused inland, leaving the sea less protected. In these gaps, pirate groups emerged. Japanese pirates were often linked to specific regions or clans. They controlled straits, taxed passing ships, and offered protection in exchange for payment. To some, they were criminals. To others, they were regulators of trade in the absence of stable authority. Their presence reflected fragmentation rather than rebellion, a practical response to uncertainty. Piracy in East Asia was rarely static. It rose and fell with political change. Strong governance reduced it temporarily. Disruption revived it. When states asserted control, pirates adapted or dissolved. When control weakened, they returned, familiar with routes and conditions that had never truly changed. Foreign trade added another layer. As contact with distant regions increased, new goods and new ships appeared. These attracted attention. Raids targeted not only local vessels, but foreign ones as well. Cultural boundaries mattered little at sea. Cargo and opportunity spoke louder than allegiance. Efforts to suppress piracy combined force and policy. Coastal patrols increased. Trade regulations shifted. In some cases, pirates were absorbed into official structures, offered positions as defenders or traders. This integration reflected a recognition that maritime skill was valuable and scarce. Turning enemies into assets proved more effective than constant pursuit. Despite suppression, piracy left a lasting imprint on maritime culture. It shaped navigation practices, port organization, and community relationships. The sea was understood as both provider and threat. Trust was negotiated carefully. Movement carried risk accepted as routine. Unlike later Western narratives, piracy in Asian waters did not crystallize into a single romantic image. It remained fluid, pragmatic, closely tied to local realities. Stories survived in fragments, shaped by regional memory rather than global myth. As night settles over the East China Sea and the waters around Japan, fishing boats and merchant vessels move quietly under familiar stars. The routes are old, the risks known. Piracy here was never an interruption of history. It was part of the rhythm of maritime life, rising and falling with the tides of power, leaving behind lessons carried silently across generations by the sea itself. The Indian Ocean has always moved to a different rhythm. Vast, open, and guided by seasonal winds, it connected distant shores long before modern maps attempted to define it. For centuries, sailors trusted the monsoon, timing their journeys to invisible patterns in the sky. Trade flowed between Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, not in haste, but in cycles. In this wide and patient world, piracy emerged quietly, shaped by distance, tradition, and changing power. Unlike enclosed seas, the Indian Ocean offered few natural boundaries. Its scale made control difficult, and authority faded quickly beyond major ports. Merchants traveled great distances, often months at sea, dependent on the weather and chance. Ships carried spices, textiles, precious stones, and later, industrial goods. Where such value moved slowly across open water, vulnerability followed. For much of history, piracy in the Indian Ocean appeared as scattered raiding rather than permanent dominance. Narrow straits, coastal inlets, and island chains provided opportunities. Attacks were brief, calculated, and often opportunistic. Raiders relied on knowledge of currents and seasonal routes rather than overwhelming force. Success depended on patience more than confrontation. Along the eastern coast of Africa, maritime life developed in close relationship with trade. Ports connected inland societies to distant markets. Cultures blended through exchange, language, and belief. Yet these connections were fragile. Shifts in trade patterns, foreign intervention, or political disruption could alter livelihoods quickly. When stability weakened, the sea became both refuge and resource. Somalia's coastline stretches along a critical corridor linking the Red Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. For generations, communities here relied on fishing and trade. Foreign vessels passed close to shore, carrying goods between continents. Yet local benefits from this movement were limited. Wealth moved through the region without settling. Over time, imbalance grew visible. Modern piracy off the Somali coast did not arise in isolation. It followed years of disruption. Civil conflict weakened governance. Coastal protections eroded. Illegal fishing by foreign fleets damaged local livelihoods. For those living along the shore, the sea changed character. What had once sustained life now appeared exploited and unguarded. In this environment, piracy re-emerged as response rather than tradition. Early actions focused on interception rather than destruction. Small groups targeted passing vessels, often with limited means. Their goals were practical: ransom, not conquest; capture, not conflict. The scale remained small at first, shaped by necessity rather than ambition. As these actions proved effective, organization followed. Networks formed, linking coastal communities with inland support. Boats, equipment, and information moved quietly. Knowledge of shipping routes became shared currency. The sea, once distant, turned into a space of calculated movement. Timing mattered. Visibility mattered. Violence remained controlled, used sparingly to maintain leverage. Global trade responded with concern. The Indian Ocean, long accustomed to quiet exchange, now carried tension. Shipping companies adjusted routes. Naval patrols increased. International coalitions formed to protect transit corridors. The sea became crowded with authority, its openness narrowed by surveillance and coordination. For those involved in piracy, conditions changed quickly. Increased presence reduced opportunity. Risks rose. Success required greater coordination and longer negotiations. Ransom systems grew complex, involving intermediaries and extended timelines. What began as immediate response evolved into prolonged process. Local perceptions remained divided. Some communities viewed piracy as exploitation. Others saw it as temporary correction in an unequal system. Support fluctuated with outcome and pressure. As enforcement intensified, the costs became clearer. Arrests increased. Operations failed more often. The balance shifted again. Piracy in the Indian Ocean never fully aligned with the romantic images formed elsewhere. It lacked flags, songs, or legend. It existed in the space between global systems and local realities. Its rise reflected gaps in governance and uneven distribution of benefit. Its decline followed coordination and presence. As years passed, international efforts reduced incidents significantly. Patrols stabilized routes. Agreements improved response time. The sea regained predictability. Yet the underlying conditions remained complex. Livelihoods, access, and equity continue to shape coastal life. As night falls over the open waters east of Africa, ships move steadily under monitored skies. The monsoon still guides the wind. Routes remain ancient. Piracy in the Indian Ocean, both past and present, reflects the sea's enduring truth. Where movement meets imbalance, responses emerge quietly, shaped not by myth, but by necessity, carried forward on tides that never fully rest. Beneath the shifting image of piracy as chaos lay a quieter structure. Life at sea demanded rules, not to impose order from above, but to prevent collapse from within. On ships where danger was constant and authority temporary, law emerged as agreement. Symbols formed not to decorate, but to communicate. Culture grew from repetition, shared risk, and the need to belong. Together, these elements shaped a world that was more disciplined than it appeared. Pirate laws were rarely grand or abstract. They were practical responses to daily uncertainty. Written articles, often agreed upon before a voyage began, outlined expectations clearly. They defined shares of profit, responsibilities, and consequences. Theft from the crew was punished more harshly than theft from outsiders. Violence among members threatened survival and was addressed swiftly. Discipline existed not to restrict freedom, but to preserve it. These rules varied from ship to ship, reflecting leadership and circumstance. Yet, common patterns appeared. Captains received limited authority, strongest during combat and restrained afterward. Decisions affecting the whole crew were discussed openly. Voting resolved disputes when possible. This balance reduced resentment and ensured cooperation. Trust was a currency more valuable than gold. Compensation for injury revealed another aspect of pirate law. Risk was acknowledged openly. Loss of limb or sight carried predetermined value. These provisions recognized that survival came at a cost, and that those who bore it deserved security. In a world without insurance or state support, this system provided a form of stability. Symbols played a different role. They were not expressions of identity alone, but tools of communication. Flags signaled intention, warning, or invitation, depending on circumstance. Their designs varied, but their purpose was consistent. Recognition could prevent resistance. Fear, once established, reduced the need for force. A symbol seen from a distance could resolve an encounter before it began. These symbols evolved organically. They drew from shared understanding rather than central design. Simplicity mattered. Clear shapes and contrasts traveled well across water. Over time, repetition turned these signs into icons, remembered long after their original meaning faded. Culture aboard pirate ships grew from routine. Daily tasks repeated regardless of weather or destination. Watches were kept, repairs made, meals shared, songs and stories passed time and reinforced identity. Language blended, shaped by diverse origins. Humor softened hardship. Rituals marked departure and return. These practices created continuity in a life defined by movement. Belief systems aboard ships were flexible. Superstition existed, shaped by the unpredictability of the sea. Omens were noted. Certain actions avoided. Yet strict doctrine rarely held. Survival encouraged adaptability. What mattered was not adherence to tradition, but awareness of circumstance. On land, pirate culture left quieter marks. Taverns near ports became gathering places where information circulated freely. Clothing reflected practicality rather than status. Reputation traveled faster than appearance. A known name carried weight beyond uniform or title. Identity was earned through action rather than inherited. This culture was not separate from the world it opposed. It borrowed from naval discipline, merchant practice, and local custom. It rejected rigid hierarchy while retaining necessary structure. It valued freedom while enforcing boundaries. These contradictions allowed it to function briefly under pressure. As piracy declined, many of these elements dispersed. Laws were forgotten. Symbols lost context. Practices blended into broader maritime tradition. Yet traces remained. Certain customs survived among sailors long after piracy ended, reshaped and absorbed into legitimate seafaring life. As night settles over a quiet deck, the remnants of this culture feel distant. The symbols no longer fly. The laws no longer bind. What remains is the memory of a community formed under extreme conditions, held together not by crowns or commands, but by agreement, shared risk, and the steady movement of the sea. As the age of active piracy faded from the seas, it did not disappear from the human imagination. Instead, it began a quieter journey, moving from lived experience into memory, and from memory into story. Freed from the constraints of reality, piracy transformed into symbol. What had once been shaped by necessity and risk slowly became shaped by words, images, and repetition. Literature and later popular culture did not preserve piracy as it was. They recreated it as it was remembered, desired, and understood. Early written accounts of pirates emerged close to the events themselves. Sailors, merchants, and officials recorded encounters with sea raiders in practical language. These texts focused on loss, danger, and disruption. Pirates appeared as threats to order, their actions framed within legal or moral judgment. Yet even within these records, fascination surfaced. The independence of pirate life, its rejection of hierarchy, and its movement beyond borders stood in quiet contrast to the rigid societies on land. As time passed, distance softened perception. Writers no longer needed to warn or instruct. They could imagine. Pirates became characters rather than adversaries. Adventure replaced accounting. Danger became backdrop rather than consequence. The sea turned into a stage on which freedom could be explored without cost. 19th century literature played a central role in shaping this transformation. Novels and stories introduced pirates as figures of mystery and charisma. They sailed under clear skies, guided by personal codes rather than desperation. Their violence was selective, their motives simplified. Treasure replaced trade routes. Maps replaced negotiations. In these stories, piracy became a journey rather than a response. This literary image settled into recognizable patterns. The pirate captain emerged as a commanding presence, feared yet admired. The crew became loyal companions bound by shared purpose. The sea was dangerous, but romantic. Storms tested character rather than survival. The harsh realities of hunger, disease, and exhaustion faded into the background. Symbols gained prominence. Flags, accents, clothing, and gestures became shorthand for identity. These elements were repeated until they defined expectation. A pirate no longer needed explanation. Appearance conveyed meaning instantly. What had once served practical communication now served recognition. As new media emerged, these images adapted easily. Theater, illustration, and later film expanded the pirate's reach. Movement and sound added depth to character. Music emphasized adventure. Visual design reinforced familiarity. Pirates became part of shared cultural language, recognizable across regions and generations. Film and television further refined the image. Pirates were no longer solely villains or heroes. They became complex figures, unpredictable, humorous, flawed. Their rebellion was framed as personal choice rather than social response. Conflict focused inward, on identity and loyalty, rather than outward, on survival. The sea remained present, but it no longer dictated action. It served as atmosphere. Children's stories played a significant role in this shift. Simplified narratives introduced piracy as play. Danger became harmless. Violence turned symbolic. Pirates were imagined as explorers of imagination rather than history. Through repetition, these stories detached piracy from consequence, allowing it to exist as fantasy. Popular culture also absorbed piracy into broader themes. Video games, festivals, and themed attractions transformed pirate imagery into experience. Costumes replaced hardship. Soundtracks replaced silence. Participation replaced observation. The pirate became a role to inhabit temporarily, without risk. This transformation did not erase history, but it reshaped attention. Certain figures were elevated, others vanished. Complex systems were reduced to personalities. The collective nature of piracy gave way to individual narrative. Democracy aboard ships became personal charisma. Law became personal code. Yet beneath these layers, traces of reality remained. The attraction to pirate stories often reflected deeper desires: freedom from rigid structure, movement without permission, community built on choice rather than birth. These themes resonated because they echoed truths that once existed, even if their context had changed. The distance between history and myth widened gradually. Each retelling added interpretation. Each adaptation removed constraint. Over time, piracy became less about the sea and more about imagination. The ocean turned symbolic, representing possibility rather than danger. As night falls over a quiet shore, stories continue to circulate. Books close, screens fade, music lingers. Pirates no longer sail these waters, but their image remains, shaped by centuries of retelling. In literature and popular culture, piracy survives, not as it was lived, but as it was remembered, transformed into a mirror, reflecting the enduring human fascination with freedom, risk, and the unknown horizon. By the beginning of the 19th century, the world at sea had changed decisively. What had once been open, fragmented, and unevenly governed was increasingly shaped by centralized authority. Empires extended their reach across oceans with unprecedented consistency. Naval power grew systematic. Trade became industrialized. In this new maritime order, piracy no longer fit easily. Its decline was not dramatic, but gradual, shaped by pressure rather than spectacle. Several forces converged to bring this transformation. Technological change altered the balance between pursuit and escape. Steam power reduced reliance on wind, making movement more predictable and less vulnerable to weather. Ships grew faster, heavier, and more durable. Communication improved, shrinking distances that pirates had once exploited. The sea, while still vast, became easier to observe and harder to hide within. Legal frameworks evolved alongside technology. Nations cooperated more closely to define and suppress piracy as a universal crime rather than a local inconvenience. Agreements crossed borders. Jurisdiction expanded. Acts once tolerated or ignored were now prosecuted consistently. The ambiguity that had allowed piracy to survive between war and peace narrowed steadily. Economic shifts played an equally important role. Global trade became more structured, dominated by large companies with resources to protect their interests. Insurance systems matured. Convoys and escorts became routine. Losses were calculated and absorbed. Piracy, once capable of disrupting entire regions, now struggled to affect systems designed for resilience. Naval presence increased in formerly distant waters. Patrols became permanent, rather than reactive. Ports were fortified not only at strategic centers, but along extended coastlines. Local authorities were integrated into imperial administration, reducing the spaces where independent raiding had once flourished. The sea grew quieter, not because risk vanished, but because it was managed. Pirates adapted as long as possible. Some shifted toward smuggling, others turned inland. A few attempted to continue openly, relying on reputation and speed, but opportunities diminished. The cost of failure rose sharply. Capture meant certain punishment rather than negotiation. The calculus changed, and with it, participation declined. By the mid-19th century, piracy as a widespread maritime phenomenon had largely faded. It survived only in isolated pockets, often tied to local instability rather than global systems. The age when piracy shaped the rhythm of trade and travel had passed. The sea belonged increasingly to states, companies, and regulated movement. Yet, as piracy disappeared from daily life, it gained new presence in memory. Distance transformed perception. What had been feared became fascinating. What had been practical became symbolic. The decline of piracy created space for reflection, and reflection invited myth. This mythologization followed familiar patterns. Harsh realities softened. Violence lost consequence. Complexity reduced to narrative. Pirates became figures of freedom rather than necessity, rebellion rather than response. Their world, once shaped by hunger, weather, and risk, became a canvas for imagination. The 19th century played a crucial role in this shift. Romanticism valued individuality, adventure, and defiance of convention. Pirates fit these themes easily. Writers and artists reinterpreted maritime history through emotional lens. The sea became a metaphor for inner journey. The pirate became a symbol of autonomy. This process was selective. Certain stories endured while others faded. Figures who aligned with emerging ideals were remembered. Anonymous crews disappeared. Collective systems were replaced by singular heroes. Democratic practices aboard ships became personal codes. Lawlessness turned into charm. Public memory simplified further through repetition. Plays, illustrations, and later early cinema reinforced familiar images. Each retelling emphasized spectacle over context. The pirate flag, once a tool of communication, became decoration. The ship, once a fragile platform of survival, became stage. This myth did not erase the past entirely. It transformed it. Traces of reality remained beneath surface imagery. The appeal of pirate stories reflected enduring questions about authority, freedom, and belonging. These themes resonated because they addressed tensions that did not disappear with piracy itself. As modern maritime order solidified, piracy moved fully into history. Its presence lingered not in shipping logs or legal records, but in culture. Songs, books, and later films carried its image forward, detached from consequence, preserved as idea. As night settles over a calm 19th century harbor, steamships rest beside stone docks. Lanterns glow steadily. The sea no longer feels unclaimed. Yet in quiet moments, imagination drifts backward toward an age of sails and uncertain horizons. Piracy ended not with silence, but with transformation, leaving behind a myth shaped by memory, distance, and the enduring human desire to see freedom where once there was only survival. As the modern world took shape, the sea did not lose its importance. Instead, it became more essential than ever. Vast quantities of goods began to move continuously across oceans, linking factories, ports, and cities into a single global system. Container ships replaced sailing vessels. Navigation relied on satellites rather than stars. Yet despite these changes, piracy did not vanish. It adapted, quietly reshaped by modern conditions. In the 20th century, piracy no longer defined maritime life as it once had, but it persisted in the spaces left unguarded by global systems. Modern states controlled most major routes, yet authority still weakened with distance, conflict, and economic imbalance. Where governance faltered, the sea remained open to reinterpretation. Piracy reemerged not as a romantic echo of the past, but as a practical response to contemporary realities. Modern pirates rarely sought legend or identity. They operated without flags or symbols meant for recognition. Their goals were immediate and specific: cargo, fuel, equipment, or ransom. Violence was generally limited, used to secure compliance rather than to intimidate through reputation. Unlike earlier eras, anonymity mattered more than notoriety. The geography of modern piracy reflected global trade patterns. Narrow choke points, busy shipping lanes, and poorly monitored coastlines became focal areas. Attacks occurred quickly, often under cover of darkness. Small boats approached massive vessels whose size limited maneuverability. The imbalance between speed and scale replaced the old balance between sail and wind. Technology changed both sides of the encounter. Pirates used radios, GPS devices, and automatic weapons. Merchant ships relied on tracking systems, alarms, and coordinated response protocols. The sea became a space of surveillance as much as movement. Each adaptation prompted another, creating a quiet cycle of escalation. Economic conditions played a central role. In regions where coastal communities faced limited opportunity, piracy offered income otherwise unavailable. This did not require ideological justification. It was framed as work, temporary, and transactional. The sea became a workplace rather than a frontier. Participants entered and exited as conditions shifted. International response evolved accordingly. Naval coalitions formed to patrol vulnerable areas. Rules of engagement were negotiated carefully. Legal frameworks expanded to address jurisdiction and prosecution. Cooperation replaced unilateral action, yet enforcement remained complex. The sea crossed borders more easily than law. Modern piracy also differed in visibility. News traveled instantly. Incidents were reported globally. Yet this attention did not translate into myth. Stories emphasized disruption rather than adventure. Piracy was framed as security concern rather than cultural phenomenon. The distance between event and imagination narrowed. In the 21st century, piracy reflected the contradictions of globalization. Goods moved freely, while opportunity remained uneven. Ships worth millions passed within sight of communities struggling for stability. This contrast shaped perception on both sides. For shipping companies, piracy was risk to be managed. For coastal participants, it was response to exclusion. As international efforts reduced incidents in many regions, patterns shifted again. Piracy declined where patrols intensified and governance improved. It reappeared where conflict or neglect returned. The cycle repeated, quieter than before, without banners or names. Modern piracy did not revive the culture of earlier centuries. It produced no enduring symbols, no shared mythology. It remained local, situational, shaped by immediate context. Its participants did not imagine themselves as inheritors of a tradition. They responded to present conditions, not past narratives. As night falls over contemporary shipping lanes, massive vessels move steadily under automated systems. Lights mark routes once guided by instinct. Somewhere beyond the glow of ports, small boats wait or turn back, measuring risk against reward. In the modern era, piracy survives not as legend, but as signal, reflecting the spaces where global order thins and the sea quietly reveals its enduring openness. When piracy is viewed from a distance, its shape becomes uncertain. What remains is not a single story, but a layered memory built from experience, imagination, and repetition. Across centuries, piracy moved through many forms: necessity, violence, adaptation, resistance, survival. Yet, as time passed, these realities softened, transformed into symbols that traveled farther than ships ever could. Between truth and legend, piracy found its lasting place. Historically, piracy was never a unified phenomenon. It emerged wherever trade moved faster than protection, where authority weakened with distance, and where the sea offered alternatives to those left behind by land-based order. Its participants were rarely driven by ideology. They responded to circumstance. Hunger, displacement, war, and imbalance shaped their choices. Piracy was not rebellion in theory, but reaction in practice. Yet memory favors simplicity. As the practical conditions that produced piracy faded, stories remained. These stories gathered meaning beyond their origins. They offered images of freedom in contrast to restriction, movement in contrast to confinement. The pirate became a figure onto which societies projected questions they could no longer ask directly. What does freedom look like? What is the cost of order? Where does authority end? Legend did not erase truth entirely. It selected from it. Certain elements endured because they resonated. The sea as open space, the ship as moving world, the crew as chosen community. These features reflected real practices, even as their context changed. Other aspects, hardship, disease, exhaustion, constant fear, receded from view. Memory preserved what inspired, not what constrained. This transformation was not accidental. Each generation reshaped piracy to fit its concerns. In times of rigid hierarchy, pirates appeared as symbols of defiance. In eras of expansion, they embodied adventure. In modern culture, they became characters, detached from consequence, shaped by humor and spectacle. Piracy's meaning shifted because society's needs shifted. The enduring legacy of piracy lies not in what pirates did, but in what they came to represent. They challenged fixed identities. They crossed boundaries. They formed temporary worlds governed by agreement rather than inheritance. These qualities, rare and unstable in reality, gained permanence in imagination. At the same time, history reminds us of limits. Pirate communities were brief. Their freedoms depended on fragile conditions. When authority adapted, piracy declined. The sea did not guarantee liberation. It offered possibility, often at great cost. Between ideal and reality lay tension, rarely resolved. Modern discussions of piracy often oscillate between condemnation and fascination. Security frameworks address it as threat. Culture reimagines it as narrative. Both perspectives reveal something essential. Piracy exists at the edge of systems, exposing where order fails to include where movement outpaces control. This duality explains its persistence in memory. Piracy refuses closure. It cannot be reduced to crime alone, nor celebrated without contradiction. It occupies a space between necessity and choice, violence and cooperation, truth and legend. This ambiguity sustains interest long after ships stop sailing. As centuries pass, the sea remains unchanged in one essential way. It connects while separating. It offers routes while resisting ownership. Piracy emerged from this character, not against it. Its legacy mirrors the sea itself, fluid, contested, reflective. As night settles over a quiet horizon, waves move without record or judgment. Stories drift onward, reshaped with each telling. Between truth and legend, piracy endures not as a chapter that ended, but as a question that continues, carried forward by the human desire to imagine freedom, where history once demanded survival.